and welcome to another edition of the Mediatwits, episode 137. We'll be talking about long-form journalism. Does it have a long-term business model? We've seen a lot of success over the years and also some failures, and now a new venture from Steven Brill and Jill Abramson that will advance writers $100,000 per piece has piqued the interest of a lot of people in the media. Will it succeed? What are its chances? And who are the competitors that are proving this business model? We'll talk about that on today's episode. First, a word from our sponsor. Running your own business requires focus, and so does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace created a place where parents could give their best quality of attention to both co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkids. And this Sunday at 9 a.m. they'll actually be having an open house at NextKids. If you're in San Francisco, you can come check it out. And indeed, I am in San Francisco at NextSpace right now for this podcast. And my one-year-old son, Everett, is next door at the childcare. So it's a great setup. So before we get into our discussion, I want to introduce our great panel today. We have Alex Lih now at Yahoo, moved over from Newsweek. We have Andrew Lih at American University. Fannie Cohen, our outgoing producer. Glenn Fleishmann, editor at the magazine, longtime journalist in Seattle. Jefferson Yen, our new podcast producer. Joanna Weiss, columnist at the Boston Globe. So, Joanna, I know you've talked a little bit about this new startup from Brill and Abramson, and the idea is, you know, this huge story, one big story each month. People would subscribe. They're saying $2.99 a month, and they're giving average advances of $100,000. What exactly that means, we don't know. And Brill and Abramson will each contribute a story. We don't know exactly what they'll be paid for that. But you know, even though the details are kind of thin, what do you think about this idea? Is it something to be excited about? Should we be skeptical? Where do you come down on that so far?
Well, far be it from me to criticize anyone who wants to pay journalists a lot of money, right? I mean, everyone would love to. I think there's going to be a long line of people who want to get in on that gig if it, you know, for as long as it lasts and if it's possible. I mean, I think everyone needs to be skeptical given the business climate, given what we've seen with so many different media outlets who started out saying, yeah, we're going to do these great big things, and it seems like long form standing alone is a really, really hard business model to sustain. On the other hand, I think we've seen a lot of media outlets from legacy newspapers like mine, the Boston Globe, to BuzzFeed, that find a way to mix content, you know, that still have long-form content and some really interesting digital packages as part of a mix that also includes more traditional newspaper stories or short stories and lists and things, you know. So I think the future of long form might be as part of a larger package as opposed to one thing that you're depending on everyone to pay money for.
Right. And, you know, Steven Brill, who's a part of this, has kind of made a name for himself starting Court TV, American Lawyer magazine. He's also had some digital failures like Inside.com. And he also was behind this, you know, part of the paywall company, Press Plus. Journalism Online became Press Plus, was bought out, I think recently merged with Piano Media around paywall. So he seems to have kind of a little bit of an obsession over paid content. I mean, you just think that's not necessarily the way to go when it comes to long form. You think it might be kind of a mix.
I do. I mean, I think there's been a lot of hope that we could somehow condition people who are used to the internet being completely free to all of a sudden start paying for things. And there's been success in some places and not success in others. I mean, you know, the Wall Street Journal has a very successful paywall. It's got a very niche audience. You know, asking people, someone like Andrew Sullivan, who asks for subscribers, has had a little bit more trouble getting people to pay for his content because there are just so many other choices. So I think it depends on what you're asking people to pay for and what the price point is, and what the medium is too. There was also an idea that You have a tablet. Suddenly people will pony up for an app on a tablet where they wouldn't necessarily pay for a subscription for a website. I don't know if that's proven itself out yet either.
Yeah, and speaking of apps, we have Glenn Fleishmann, who is running the magazine, which was an app with long-form content. Tell us about your model, and I know you recently announced you're not going to be doing it any further, but you did have a subscription model. Tell us about kind of the rise and fall of the subscription model for you, because I think that we've heard about that from other places like Byliner as well.
Yeah, well, I think the magazine is inextricably has multiple concepts intertwined. So our content side was the easiest thing, and we had great feedback from readers. And I don't think the cost was wrong. I think there were a ton of structural issues that came out of being tied into Apple's ecosystem, and also the interest in when Marco Arment, who designed the app and launched it, who I bought the publication from about a year and a half ago, he designed something that was almost like the apotheosis of what an iPad app could be. It was sort of clean and stripped down. It had the right aesthetic, and there was the other digital replica apps that were available from major publications were all seen as sort of bloated and not really taking advantage. So we got this huge onrush initially. We had people poured in who wanted to see what the future of iPad style, tabloid style publications could be. And I feel like we didn't necessarily prove that people would pay for content. We proved that we could get the attention behind a new kind of way of looking at things. And the content was unfortunately, at some level, secondary to a lot of subscribers. So, we're privately held, so I could tell you, we had maybe about $400,000 in revenue in the first year. It was about half that in the second, and we're on track to have that again, which is why I'm shutting it down. But it was a profitable, successful experiment, and terrific feedback from readers, but just very difficult to do the traditional magazine periodical thing, which is circulation issues, churn, finding new audiences, dealing with subscriber fatigue. You don't lose any of those things, and the fact that people can unsubscribe and Apple makes it so easy and reminds people to unsubscribe puts a heavier burden on a publication like us that does not have a huge marketing budget or other media properties with which to promote what we're doing.
Only could be as difficult as it is to unsubscribe from a newspaper or something, right?
I know. It's like I don't want unwilling subscribers.
It's so easy.
But Apple, I'll just tell you the one thing that every month, and as everybody working in publications appreciate, every month for monthly subscribers, Apple sends email 4 days before it renews and says, "Hey, did you remember you have this?" Like, oh, come on, send them a receipt, not a reminder, and then people could unsubscribe, they could get refunds. But it's even like the little structural things like that, I think, decimated our subscription base.
Interesting. Alex, did you want to jump in about just the product side of doing subscription products online?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about this. So we've heard a lot about the journalist pay. We have heard almost nothing about the product or platform and how the distribution model will work. And I think, so I brought Piano to Newsweek before it merged with Press Plus. Getting people to subscribe to, through a soft paywall or through Apple or through any of these things, you have to follow the rules of there's legal rules around all these things, but there's also rules of all of these platforms, whether it's Amazon or Apple, as Glenn was referring to. And so the distribution model, because Jill had mentioned in one of the articles that she doesn't want to have a website, and I get the reason behind that, but a website is infinitely cheaper and easier and cheaper to maintain and use than an app, which constantly needs to be updated in terms of screen sizes and retina, and every time Apple makes a new product and every time someone comes out with a phone that looks like a small baby, like everything needs to be changed. So this is something to consider, and they seem to be going through this lean back experience where you're going to be reading these incredibly long stories, and to do that they're going to have to play in the mobile space, and that is not clear to me what they're going to do there.
It's true. And we have to go back a little bit in time to kind of the Kindle Singles and what Byliner was trying to do, which was kind of a lean back experience, but you would pay, $2.99, $1.99 for a long story. Byliner came out with an amazing story from John Krakauer, 3 Cups of Deceit, that did so amazingly well. Andrew, what did you think about can we learn something from the kind of rise and fall of these Kindle Singles and Byliner? I mean, obviously, Amazon's probably doing pretty well with Kindle Singles, but I don't know about anybody else.
Yeah, when I saw that $100,000 price or commission amount, at first I said, that's really attractive from the normal amounts you see from the the pure feature article journalism magazine side. But then if you look at it from the other side, which is more like book publishing, it's actually a okay advance, and I think it's probably more like a book advance than anything else. And we all kind of know how the book publishing side is going, and more folks who get a book contract like that have to hustle and make their story known in other ways, or to have other venues for that to succeed, right? So you're expected to go out there not just to write the book, but to create a conversation, to create multimedia around it. More and more when you're doing book pitches, they want to see that you can do media, video, maybe audio, stuff like that. So that's where I see a lot of this having to be part of the formula going forward. A standalone long-form thing these days, really hard to do. But there's that appetite out there, right? So if you look at something like the Serial podcast, which has been really successful, one of the main reasons why it has been successful is not just because you're listening to it in isolation through your earbuds or in your car, but because people now hop onto Reddit and start discussing it and start to have this whole community of folks trying to figure it out. And you see the same thing with Netflix series and Amazon series, that once you create a community around the story and that there's a reason to keep going with the author and the narrative, that's where you start to see a real interesting model come up. So I think a lot more folks doing the long rights or the long content have to keep that in mind, because the isolated long-form print piece on its own, you read it and 20 minutes later you put it down and you move on to the next thing. That's not really going to have a lot of support these days.
And also on that point, to Andrew's point, Serial is it's not a for-profit thing. It's a spin-off from This American Life, which is funded by its users in a not-for-profit way. And that's ProPublica, when they came out with their Tylenol story, that cost $750,000 to do. But again, they are not for profit. Like, doing this kind of investigative journalism for profit is something that is rough if you're doing it standalone. We've really only seen it from California Watch and other kind of subsidized organizations.
It would be interesting to find out whether the market could support a Serial where people pitch in an amount, right? So what if Serial actually did put the shingle out there and say, hey, you can either donate to it or it'll cost you $1.99 a month. At this point, at least, it's hard to evaluate after it's been released, but at this point, I think there'd be lots of folks being willing to pay $2 a month to get Serial the way it's going on now.
I've assumed that there's an issue, too, that the Brill and Abramson venture is completely tied in with movie advances too. I mean, this has been, the New Yorker had the division. I've forgotten the group that spun off from. Atavist, I think, has had some licensing. But if you can get an extremely modest, they can lock down the film rights, then that takes care of a huge chunk of that advance too. So I'm assuming there's a multi-platform issue, and they're only going to take stories that they think actually could be made into something where they'll get those sorts of large fees to help supplement or repay them.
I'm curious. I'm curious too how much brand names are a part of this. I mean, John Krakauer, the example given before, he's an established brand already. Serial has a huge audience on its own merits, but was connected to This American Life, and I think that brought a lot of people in. I'm not sure Jill Abramson's name, while very well known in journalism circles, is big enough even, or Steven Brill's name, honestly, outside the industry, is big enough alone to draw a large audience. On the other hand, if they are picking and choosing brand names, maybe people who are already kind of rich, to get these $100,000 advances, that might draw a bigger audience off the bat.
Yeah, I think the brand name does make a difference. If you see what Medium is doing, like Stephen Levy now has a whole kind of tech section of Medium, and he's using his name as the curator and editor of that to grab folks to contribute to that, and those are going to be long reads going forward. And I think there's some value to that.
I would just like to go back to the pay, the $100,000 tagline. That was the headline for this story, like all over the internet. And when I look at the numbers of people that have released how much it costs to do investigative journalism, California Watch did, what was that story called, The Big Shake, or On Shaky Ground. So they said that cost them $550,000 to do, but and the bulk of that was in journalist time. So when you're getting $100,000 and then maybe some of the rev share, like that might not actually, if they're expecting these to be Pulitzer Prize worthy, really investigated, highly reported pieces, $100,000 might not actually be that much money when you amortize it over the cost of these people's time.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't seem unreasonable to me for that kind of payment.
Well, you've also got to wonder, does that $100,000 also count travel and all the other related expenses to reporting and investigating a big story? I mean, yeah, I think that's an issue with book advances sometimes too. The research can be very costly in addition to just your time. So what does that $100,000 cover? I haven't seen that.
Yeah, I want to get back to something else that Joanna had mentioned, and that's the idea of, the kind of, I guess we could say, the traditional idea of long-form investigative pieces being a part of a mix where, the sports section is helping to offset the cost of the investigative pieces, and we know a lot of investigative teams in traditional media are being downsized to some extent, although they're coming up now at places like BuzzFeed. So, this idea that there is, the really viral kind of fluffy content is going to help support your investigative pieces. I mean, do we think that's going to be a part of this mix as well?
Yeah, I've been saying for a while that I thought the ProPublicas of the world, I mean, both for-profit and non-profit, are really like the old investigative divisions of newspapers without the money. I mean, you look at, I'm still lucky to be in a town like the Seattle Times that any criticisms one may have of the Blethyn family and their finances and their editorial policies about the death tax and inheritance tax aside, they fund enterprise reporting, and they do multi-year, sometimes multi-million-dollar reporting that has an incredible social good, and I feel sad for any community that does not have a committed newspaper or local media entity that gets that. And I think it's rare in smaller towns especially, but even in some larger ones, that's an issue. And so I look at Paul Carr's NSFW Corp, for instance, I thought was a perfect example. I was really eager for him to succeed with that. He and I have had online disputes, but I was eager for his publication to succeed because I felt that NSFW Corp was trying to exactly do that. It was like, let's find a sustainable model to do an investigative journalism that is exactly as if there were the sports and classified ads and whatever. We're just going to do this. Will people pay for it separately? And I think they may have been too ambitious at the time, but I think that is the issue. Is like, how do you cross-subsidize when there's no other subsidy to do the kinds of meaningful work at a scale that people both care about and is sustainable, you can do over a period of time. We didn't do really investigative work, or a couple pieces we've run over the history of the magazine that were like that, partly because of the cost. A regular feature is relatively inexpensive, and an investigative thing that balloons out of shape. But I think that is one of the losses we've had with the reduction in the scale of newsrooms and reduction number of publications, is that cross-subsidy you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, what about this idea, this $100,000 idea? I mean, it sounds a little bit like Uber saying the drivers are going to make $90,000. I mean, we all know that this is like everything else in books, ebooks, Kindle Singles, whatever. There are hits, and then there's everyone else, and there are going to be a lot of people who aren't going to get the $100,000. There might be people getting more. There'll be, I'm guessing, a lot more people getting less. And that's the part that I think people don't want to think about. And I think that was also the lesson of Byliner. Laura Hazard-Owen had a great piece about the numbers behind Byliner and who made, she didn't have, let's say, Krakauer's amount that he made, but she noticed how a lot of the writers might have gotten a few $1,000s for a really long piece, which isn't exactly what everyone wants, but that might be the reality of what people will get now.
Yeah, and that's the workaday thing, is I think we're paying very decent rates for a digital-only publication, especially like sort of a born digital independent, but we were paying $800 for 1,500 to 2,500 words, which I actually find unacceptable as I'm paying it, and our long-term goal was to increase subscriptions so we could start to pay $1 a word, pay expenses, and so forth. And there are a handful of publications that I work with as a veteran writer, but not a A-list feature writer, where I can get a rate that I think is commensurate with the amount of work required to delve deep. And I think this is an ongoing problem, and I'd suspect one one would hope that the business models would support a livable investigative wage for the kinds of stories they want, but I haven't seen very much evidence for that.
Yeah, Glenn, I was wondering how much, related to your story, how much do you think the payment platform is a hindrance to this all? I mean, when I first read about your publication and how Apple was kind of the throttle to your success, I kind of had some misgivings about whether that was sustainable, and the inability to have this kind of one payment system across all platforms. Give me some sense of where you think it is now and where you think it's going.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely true. Is that once you're locked into an ecosystem, even though Apple makes it possible to, people can pay there and we can give access to any platform we want to, and that was not necessarily the case when Apple launched on Newsstand and its Newsstand. It wasn't precisely as flexible about that. It got better, but I think having a centralized way to pay, it dates back to Brill's earlier effort and all the micropayment efforts and all sorts of ways that have been experimented with to provide some kind of ease of payment. And I think what it fundamentally works down to is people don't value digital content as highly. So if you're trying to get people to pay an unbundled subscription, like pay us $2 a month and we're going to deliver this, I don't know if the value proposition works for the average person unless you're producing something highly specialized or highly compelling. And so, even at a $2 a month rate, because people want to read more than the $2 a month thing, and they don't wind up wanting to have 15 subscriptions at $2 a month each. That's unusual. So I think there's actually more of a need today for a micropayment system that would allow the sort of pick and choose browsing across a lot of media platforms, the web, apps, whatever the mechanism is. I think there's more of a need for that now than there has been in the past, but I don't see any mechanism to make it happen. I think it's very difficult, as you all know, to get someone to say, it's one thing if you're delivering a daily newspaper in print every day or even through an app edition. Everything that's less frequent than that, it's harder to find the right value proposition for people and then harder to get that money out of them.
Yeah, I think that this is an amazing point. I think there is a lot of hope in the kind of centralized mobile payment things we're seeing for the future of this, especially as readership for so many companies, for so many digital content companies, goes way, 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 way towards mobile. Most companies have more than 50% of their readership on mobile, whether they are website first or not. But this is obviously going to need a different business model. Like, this can't just be, we've seen in Matthew Ingram's column in GigaOM that even if they were doing this and people were paying a la carte, that they would need 800 subscribers just to offset the cost of the $100,000, which does not include any marketing, audience development, platform production, etc. So what was mentioned earlier about the movie tie-in or whatever other kind of partnerships they're going to make, this story is going to need to make money on its own with B2B plays. There's just no other way to do it. It can't be a completely B2C system.
The other thing that could be interesting in terms of mobile payments is, and not to harp on Apple as the avatar of this, but frankly, Apple Pay is an extraordinary technology, and I've been using it, and it is vaguely magical and weird, and in a way that surprises me as a jaded veteran technology reporter that I didn't expect to be surprised and to like it. And I'm thinking, well, what if the magazine, instead of being this subscription-driven thing, was that, hey, to read the rest of this article, put your thumb here and you'll be charged 15 cents. The amount of friction in that is negligible, and it still ties you into an ecosystem, but it doesn't require the cumbersome circulation-based, old-style approach, and it lets you have that viral thing. Everybody's reading this article. 100,000 people put their thumb down, and you've suddenly made $15,000 off an article where there's no good mechanism to do that. I think between the micropay, the ease of payments, and the capitalizing on focus. So I do think that could be amazing in the right structure, and if Apple actually wanted to do that for us.
What you're describing is combining digital content with Candy Crush. Like, literally, that's what you're talking about.
You win the internet. This is true. Absolutely.
Joanna, did you want to jump in about that, about just the chances? Micropayments, we've tried that before, and it hasn't worked, but iTunes is probably the closest we've come to micropayments being frictionless.
No, I mean, I think that seamlessness is so critical. I just think of myself as a user and how easy it is, even if you just come across that screen that says pay up or register, how easy it is to click away, because you know that there is so much good content out there. You might really want to read this thing, but if someone's explicitly asking you to pony up at that moment, your brain says, there are also another 10 or 15 fantastic things I could read right now, and there you go. And so that thumb idea is fascinating to me, and anything that makes it feel easy, effortless, that almost gets inside your brain without forcing you to make a conscious decision seems like the answer. Otherwise, the other side of the answer is not micro bundling, but consolidation of some form, which is a scary idea. But again, a lot of these larger media outfits have the capacity to separate their operations, to have all kinds of different operations at once, to have the easy money operations that then do or the ad revenue driven operations that do bring a lot of money that can subsidize this content that everyone wants, but that it's hard to get people to make the conscious decision to pay for.
I hear Pierre Odermayer has some openings at his company.
Yeah, I mean, we've looked at the nonprofit model so many different ways. Whether it's the billionaire outlets or whether it's nonprofits that are springing up all over the country as part of like the investigative news network. No matter whether you're nonprofit, you're for-profit, you still have to have income. You still have to have a way to support yourselves. And I mean, well, I guess there are more billionaires every day, so I guess we'll just keep going to them over again as much as we can to see which one's going to pay off next.
That's been my joke. I'm like, which billionaire or shady, large, privately held LLC do you work for? And it's going to be one or the other.
Yeah, that's kind of the state of our industry, sadly, at sometimes. But we'll see. We'll give Brill and Abramson their chance to see if they can pull something off. And they've got their one investor. Let's take odds on whether it's a billionaire or a trillionaire that's going to be that one investor. I'm curious, just one last question for you guys. Who has paid for a piece of investigative journalism or a long-form piece recently? Just put out $1 or $2 or something like that, or maybe even donated. I mean, I can't remember. I mean, I know I got some Byliner singles at one point, but it just seems like something we're not conditioned to do. It's not something that comes easy for us to just think, I'm going to pay my $2 or $3 for a piece of journalism.
I donate to like PBS and This American Life and all of those kinds of things, and Wikimedia,
So, and crowdfunding campaigns, I mean, would you say you do that more than paying for a piece?
Yes.
Yeah, like Patreon is getting big now in terms of funding podcasters. I mean, we had an interesting visit from a bunch of our students here at AU down to National Geographic, which is really interesting. So, we were visiting the new editor-in-chief, the first female editor-in-chief of National Geographic, Susan Goldberg. And it was fascinating because I really hadn't looked at the subscription price of Nat Geo for a long time. And believe it or not, the print edition is still $15 a year, which is just insanely cheap, and what a great deal, right? So that's $15 a year for the print edition. If you want just the digital, it's $12. But the funny thing is, to my students, that $12 seemed really, really expensive, right? To pay $12 a year, $1 a month for the digital, it's just bits, So just as Glenn talked about before, we don't have a great history of paying for something that we can't touch. But for folks say, oh, $15 for the print edition, that's a great bargain. So that's what's so funny about it. And if you pay an extra $4, so for $19 you get the print and the digital. And the folks who were there thought that was a great deal. But the $12 for the digital only was not a good deal. So that's kind of what you're up against in terms of the economics of paying for this stuff. We're still not, even with the digital millennials or the digital natives, still not used to paying for pure digital.
Well,
Go ahead, Joanna.
I was going to say, Alex is talking about doing the pledge drive made me remember. I mean, those pledge drives are incredibly successful for Boston NPR radio stations. They rake it in. TV stations. It's a really successful model that's built on loyalty, listener loyalty, viewer loyalty, subscriber loyalty. I've heard it floated even as something that some people thought that seen it, but you know, this idea that you have created such a long-term connection and relationship with your audience that you can go back to them and just ask them to pay for what they think it's worth. I mean, it's an interesting idea of something that, you know, you have to, but asking for it first before you've built up that relationship seems like the harder thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Andrew Sullivan does, you know, like he is basically, he's the guy who's doing it the best, but it's his commentary, his expenses are so much lower than someone that's doing a lot of on-the-ground work. He's a commentator more than a journalist, or a reporter, rather, so I can't imagine anyone being able to make enough money through that on their own. You know, I think that the kind of these big pledge drives that happen around brands like This American Life or NPR or whatever, those are always hugely successful, and I would totally give money if New York Times decided to go not-for-profit tomorrow. I would donate more than I pay for my subscription.
It's interesting. It's kind of a perception, really, and that we're willing to give when we feel like it's a real good cause, but we're not going to necessarily give to Jeff Bezos or to Pierre Omidyar. All right, well, thanks, everyone. Great discussion. I want to thank our roundtable guests, Alex Leo, now at Yahoo, Andrew Lih at American University, Fannie Cohen, our sadly departing MediaShift producer, Mediatwits producer, going on to Discovery Channel, Glenn Fleishmann at the magazine, Jefferson Yen, our incoming Mediatwits producer, Joanna Weiss at the Boston Globe. I want to thank our sponsor, NextSpace and NextKids in Potrero Hill. You can learn more about them at nextspace.us/nextkids and come to their open house 9 a.m. this Sunday in San Francisco, Potrero Hill. Catch us each and every week on Friday on the Mediatwits. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend.